The Education Committee of Nebraska Legislature tackled 3 subjects in one this afternoon.
As Brian Mastery reports, the debate became more about social issues, including what recently happens with education curriculum changes in Florida.
Prompted things like learning materials that indicated that slavery was a benefit to African Americans. Do you agree with that?
Well, no. I mean, slavery's wrong. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But, you know, hopefully we all benefit one way or another from our background. And I'm not saying specifically slavery.
Senator Dave Merman testified that more needs to be done in Nebraska schools. He believes courses to help with social and emotional learning are going too far, bringing race and gender too much into the equation.
Last summer, a few colleagues joined me in calling for an inquiry into the promotion and injection of critical race theory into the professional development of teachers.
The new education commissioner, a month into his job, told the committee he's focused on what he sees as the top issues: the teacher shortage, test scores, and how to be better.
I don't know that we can ever get away from having something be totally non-controversial, but hopefully we can develop a process that makes a lot of sense as we're developing content.
Others testified that what is taking place now is working. Mike Pate with the Millard School Board says parents' input remains a key value, but some of the changes proposed would simply take away local control.
The creation of an online parent transparency portal is both excessively cumbersome for teachers and costly for districts, as it is required to be updated weekly and monthly. Districts have policies now, as required by current law, that allow parents the opportunity to review any of the materials outlined in the bill.
It's not clear whether enough was heard today at the hearing in order to craft a bill that would be introduced next year. On your side, Brian Mastery, 6 News.
The public was not invited to the hearing today. The chair of the Education Committee, Senator Merman, handed out invites to people he thought would cover all the perspectives.